Eta argibide guztia.
Right, now we've got the instructions out of the way. Let us introduce our first speaker. Joaquin Gorrochategui is a professor of Indo-European Linguistics at the University of Basque Country, an academic member of Jakiunde, the Basque Academy of Science, Art and Humanities, Euskaltzaindia, the Basque Language Academy, and the Royal Spanish Academy. And I'm sure that his name will ring a few bells, because he's one of the experts who has been in charge of analyzing the Irulegi hand. The Irulegi hand is the first known text written by the Vascons. Today, he will talk to us about comparative linguistics and the origins of the Basque language. So, a warm round of applause, please, for Professor Joaquin Gorrochategui.
Arratsaldeon guztiei.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all thank the organizers, and especially Pedro Miguel Echenique, for having me here. He was a colleague at university and also at Jakiunde. I really thank you for inviting me to this wonderful science festival. I feel honored to be here today. And I feel a little bit nervous, I must confess, because there are so many Nobel laureates around me that makes me feel a little bit nervous. My presentation will be about comparative linguistics and the origins of the Basque language. The origins of the Basque language have always aroused curiosity, and not only in recent times, and not just in the Basque Country, of course. And this is not just due to the discovery of the Irulegi hand. This curiosity has always been related to the isolation and the supposed antiquity of the Basque language. Basque is, along with Burushaski in Pakistan and Ainua in Japan, one of the most famous isolated languages in the world, if not the most famous one. These languages have no genetic relationship with any other languages in the world, so they cannot be included in known language families. So according to linguists, there are currently about 210 linguistic families in the world, and they're very different. And 50 of these 210 linguistic families are made up of two languages. Some of them include more than 800 languages, and at the top of the list, with more than 1,400 languages, we can find the Atlantic Congolese families. So along with these families, there are isolated languages, such as Basque, for which no relationship has been found so far. And here it needs to be said that it is important to distinguish isolated languages from unclassified ones, because the latter do not provide enough information for us to determine whether or not they have languages that are related to them. In this group of languages, we can find some European languages that have already disappeared, like, for instance, Iberian, the language spoken in the Iberian Peninsula. According to Campbell, there are still about 100 isolated languages spoken in the world. Most of them are in serious danger of extinction. They represent only 1.55% of the nearly 6,000 languages that are spoken all over the world. However, the genetic classification of languages is an achievement of comparative linguistics. When Franz Bopp compared the verbal system of Sanskrit with that of Greek, Latin, Persian, and Germanic in 1816, he not only revealed the similarity between all these languages, but also, well, that was obvious, but also he also proclaimed something more important, which is that they constituted a family, and that, consequently, they must have a single and identical origin. So in the following years, the importance of that statement was consolidated. Rasmus Rask and Jacob Grimm realized that what they called letters, that is, the sounds of words that have the same origin, fitted together in a regular way. That is, that there were sound or phonetic correspondences between words of the same origin, or cognates, which is a technical term we use. These correspondence were regular and systematic, as can be seen in the consonants of the Germanic languages when compared with those of Latin or Greek. And we can see that up on the screen, this table. The voiceless occlusive consonants, P, T, K, of the classical languages correspond to the fricatives of the Germanic languages. The voiced occlusive consonants B, D, G correspond to the voiceless stops, and the aspirated or fricative stops correspond to the voiced stops. From this moment on, the main task of the comparative method has been to find cognates between languages, taking into account that these must be interrelated with each other, both in their meaning and in their form, through the sound correspondences that we have mentioned earlier on. Therefore, linguistic kinship is reflected in the cognates, and these do not have to have a similar appearance, but rather meet the requirements of the correspondence. This is not about what they look like, but rather about the existing correspondence. Therefore, although both the French word feu and the German Feuer mean fire, they are not cognates. They are superficially similar, but the initial F of German, as we have seen, must come from a P. And in fact, Feuer is a cognate of the Greek term pyro. Comparative linguistics does not limit itself to discovering correspondences and describing them in an illustrative way, but it goes beyond that. So continuing with the previous example, if we consider that father in Germanic, Peter in Sanskrit, pater in Latin, and apar in Gaelic, all of them mean father, come from a single source, we could ask ourselves what the term for father would be in that original language. And since it is reasonable to think that there was one single term, not 5 or 6 different ones, we should be able to guess which of the different possibilities was the right one. And considering the terms that do not match the right one as regular evolution. So Grimm decided that in the original language, father, the term father, had to begin with a P, and that the Germanic language had always changed P letters into F letters. That's to say, he introduced the temporal axis in the records of sound correspondence that until then were nothing more than an ahistoric description. When analyzing the history of languages, like the history of any society or institution, it is very difficult to go beyond the limits set by the witnesses and the existing documents. By comparing related languages, on the other hand, comparative linguistics illustrate the prehistory of languages. First of all, the linguistic prehistory, that of the language itself, and then the prehistory of the society or the place where the language is located.
Indo-European.
So we could conclude that the language that was the closest to Latin was Faliscan. Here we have a slide that I have made myself that illustrates the Indo-European family. We see the case of sœur in French, and I would like to show you how we would go from sœur to the Indo-European language. And the same thing goes for other branches. So we have this tree, right? And this is why we can move from the top to the bottom of this slide. So, for instance, ahar and sister and sir are quite different, but all those terms come from the Indo-European term. Comparative linguistics has explained not just the history of languages, but also other issues, like, for instance, the country where those languages come from. And here we have the contribution of archaeology and genetics as well. So in that collaboration, what we do is we suggest which could be the original locations of the Indo-European language. There are two hypotheses in this case. One states that the source was in the large steppe and grassland areas of Russia and Ukraine, from which it spread in the Bronze Age, and a second hypothesis defends that the source is to be found in Anatolia, from where, with the expansion of agriculture, the language also spread. It is obvious that the origin of Indo-European languages is not to be found in Western Europe, which has an impact on the prehistory of Basque and the Basque people. But what do we know about the history of the Basque language? Well, the first texts in Basque date from the 16th and the 16th centuries, that is from 500 or 600 years ago. But what can we do if we want to go beyond the 15th century, back in history? Do we have any way to shed some light on that long, dark prehistory? Well, we have two sources of information here. One, the one that the language itself has preserved, and then the other one would be the information that has been transmitted to neighboring languages. Languages preserve information from previous phases, on the one hand in morphophonological variants and modifications that can be seen in some words or morphemes, and on the other hand in loans from other languages. Me, ardau, ardau. If we compare these terms, we can conclude that the older form of me used to be mimi, for instance. So there's been an internal rearrangement there. It's not something that comes from other languages, but the methodology is the same. So once we've analyzed this, the conclusion we can draw would be that the N between vowels has disappeared here, has been dropped. Loans are also very important here because they help us very much in this attempt to clarify this issue. In the second table here, at the top of this slide, we see some loan words that come from Latin, area, from sand, from arena in Latin, and we see that the N has been dropped as well. So these examples confirm what we just mentioned. On the other hand, they also add a chronological element here. So, by crossing all the information provided by this internal reconstruction and loans, Michelena was able to suggest that there is a stage prior to the phonological system of the Basque language that is technically called Proto-Basque. Proto-languages are difficult to date in absolute terms if there is no external information available. And this is where Michelena carefully dated Proto-Basque between the first contacts with Latin and late antiquity. So this Proto-Basque language matches with information provided by the names used in ancient Aquitaine. And this leads us to the second type of information mentioned above, the one that is available in documents and sources from ancient times.
The name Aquitaine was used for the first time by Julius Caesar
to designate the territory bounded by the Pyrenees, the Garonne River, and the ocean. The historian A. Lucher proclaimed in 1877 that many of the names found on the stones and altars of Aquitaine, such as Sison, Andere, Nescate, Bioge, and the like, had a clear explanation through Basque. You can see them up there on the screen. Andere, Nescate, Bioge. Basque was the key to interpreting these terms. And at that time, at least according to the hypothesis of Basque Iberianism, Basque was considered to be an ancient and widely spoken generalized language of the Iberian Peninsula. So it was a direct descendant of the Iberian language that was spoken throughout almost all of Hispania before the arrival of the Romans. That was a hypothesis that was advocated at that time, at least. And in fact, evidence supporting these ideas can be found in what you can see here on the screen. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a monument or a plaque which is located in Pamplona. It's called the Monument to the Fueros of Navarre. You probably won't understand it because it's not in a Latin alphabet, but in 1903 it was decided that this was in fact an alphabet. In the 19th century there were many attempts to try to decipher the Iberian script, most of them to no avail, until Gómez Moreno succeeded in doing so, but that wasn't until the second decade of the 20th century. And this feat had important consequences because, contrary to popular belief, one script was used for two different languages, Celtiberian and Iberian. The former became associated with the Celtic languages, while the Iberian remained, as before, in relative obscurity. So a lot of headway was made in the study of the Iberian languages, but we're interested in something else. Today, at least. And in fact, Gómez Moreno himself carried out studies of the linguistic map of the Iberian Peninsula. And he did that using proper nouns that he found in different Latin epigraphs, like the one that we can find in Aquitaine. Now, he was struck by the fact that the proper nouns of the Basque country didn't look Basque. That the ones in the west could be associated with Celtiberian, and the ones in the east seem to be more associated with Iberian. And some years later, Schmoll came to the conclusion that the Basque that was found in the southern region was the result of a migration from Aquitaine during late antiquity. So, late antiquity, we're talking between the 4th and the 7th centuries. And it was a migration from the north, from Aquitaine. So within a few years, Basque went from being considered an ancient and widely spoken language of the peninsula to actually being considered a foreign language in its own territory. So that's what things were. That was the state of affairs in 1960, but from then on, things began to change. Because in the opinion of Michelena, the names on the funerary stele of Lerga, which you can see on the screen, clearly showed that in the land of the Bascons, a language was spoken that could be related to Aquitaine, and consequently to the Basque language as well. The stele was the only one of its kind to be found, at the time at least, but since then there's been a constant trickle of new discoveries, and that's confirmed the legitimacy of this opinion. And moreover, in recent years, I myself have found traces of Bascon in very unexpected regions. For example, in the Tierras Altas, which translates as highlands, of Soria. So if we were to put all the names or the nouns belonging to the Basque line from Aquitaine and the Basque territories onto a map, this would be the result. As you can see, there are some gaps. There are some areas where there are no little dots on the maps. So it's very difficult to actually assign those nouns or those names to languages. Because proper nouns don't have a meaning, they just give us a reference, they're just a reference. Sometimes they're just the result of random assignations of sounds to certain ideas. But if we have a look at the nouns in Aquitaine, although there are no direct equivalents in Basque, you can see that there are certain aspects that can only be explained in relation to Basque. They can't be explained anywhere else. So, for example, the abundance of H in all positions of the world, etc. There are a number of different characteristics. There's another thing that's important to note. And as Untermann highlighted, noun roots, suffixes, and phonological features tend to be united and combined in a coherent way within a limited and determined territory. So, in other words, they form a Namenlandschaft, or a word landscape, or a noun landscape, or an onomastic area. So, if we go to the south, there are fewer nouns. And in fact, there's also a lack of nouns that are related to expressions of age, sex, and kinship that are so characteristic in Aquitaine. So they're not so frequent in the south. So girl, father, for example, those nouns almost don't exist, with the only exception being umesar, which is a word that appears on the Lurga inscription. However, they do behave similarly in terms of sound distribution. So there's a presence of a lot of aspiration, especially the NH and RH groups, in which the sibilants at the end of the word are pronounced as affricate. The use of specialized suffix to denote women's names, and then the HE ending used to denote the names of divinities. All of these are characteristics shared exclusively with Aquitanian and with Basque. So the language of the Bascons was, therefore, according to these nouns, close to Aquitanian. But it's very difficult to calculate the exact distance between these languages due to the scarcity and the nature of the different documents that are available. We're talking about written language here because we're just talking about nouns here. And we didn't have anything until just a short while ago. In Aquitaine, things are more or less the same. We haven't found any more texts, but here, just 30 years ago, in 1993, a wonderful discovery was made at the Andelo site next to Mendigorria. It was a very usual and unexpected discovery. It was a mosaic that was very similar to another Iberian mosaic that had been discovered years earlier in Camin Real. If you want to see it, it's in the Museum of Navarre. So, although they're similar in some senses, there are significant differences between the two texts. So, if we compare the two texts, we can see that personal nouns and place names, they can be identified very easily, correctly. However, the suffixes, which follow the proper nouns, they're different. And more than that, we have bilbiris and kaluris. And the centre of these words should have been fairly similar, but in fact they're very different. If we look at the mosaic discovered in Camin Real, we see something that's quite common in Iberian letter. We have personal names which end in te or ekier. But in Andelo, what we find is ekien. So what's the reason for this difference? Could it be, I don't know, could it be an intrinsic reason? Could it be something to do with the language itself? The difference between the passive and the active form? Or could it be that these inscriptions are just written in two different languages? And if this was in fact the case, and there are some people who do sustain this theory, then this can be quite evident in the form of ekien, because ekien comes from egien, which appears in the 16th century Basque. Now, obviously, this isn't easy to answer. This question is not an easy question to answer. But there are other questions as well that still require an answer. Abun is a proper noun. There are many things that we still need to discover. So we're just waiting for someone to shed some light on this, but in the meantime, we continue to study all of these things. And while we were doing that, we found the hand of Irulegi. Now, this is an extraordinary discovery in Paleo-Hispanic history. Nothing like it has ever been found. It's unique for many reasons. What are these reasons? Well, because of the support, because of what it's actually written on. It's a severed right hand. That's not something you see all the time. We'll see And then, because of the writing process itself, that makes it unique. Because the text was esgraffitoed, and then it was stippled over using a punch. And then the two versions of writing differ on some points, and this obviously poses certain problems, as you can probably understand, because we have to decide, in all of our ignorance, which version, the esgraffitoed version or the stippled version, was the right one or the definitive one or one they actually wanted to write. And despite having a standard non-dual Iberian script, we still see that there's a capital T-shaped letter that has to date been found almost exclusively on coins belonging to the Bascons. Now, this is very curious. It kind of assures us a little bit, because it assures us that the hand is autochthonous, so it hasn't just, been brought here from somewhere else. But on the other, it provides absolutely no clue whatsoever as to the value of the letter, because nobody knows what it means. And so the text is peculiar, it's a little strange, but the epigraph itself is actually very dark. It's much darker than we expected. Now, it's true that the first line of the sculpted version reads Sorioneku, which immediately reminds us of the Basque word sorioneko, which means fortunate. But I don't know, this connection poses some problems that are not easy to resolve. First of all, we know that a KU from antiquity cannot become a KO in later Basque. And then second, as Professor Lacarra has explained, the unification or grammaticalization of the expression, and above all its generalization, happened after the 18th century. But I do continue to think that there is some connection between Sorioneku and Sorioneko, but at the moment I cannot prove it. So to shed some light on all of this darkness, we shouldn't forget that this epigraph is etched onto a support that's shaped like a hand. It's not just etched onto an ordinary metal plate. And this position, must have had a known meaning for the readers of the time, for the people that were going to read it. So the hand itself must have had its own symbolism. It must have wanted to sort of convey some kind of message. But this hand doesn't show what the Celtiberian tessere showed, i.e. the existence of a hospitality pact, but rather it kind of corresponds to the right hand that someone has cut off one of their enemies after they have defeated them during a war. I think that's what it actually is signifying. And if we're going to make comparisons, we can make comparisons with the hands that appear on some stelae in the region of Huesca and Teruel, and above all with the lead hand of Alcubierre, which is actually quite similar. Unfortunately, the lead hand of Alcubierre doesn't contain any inscriptions, and the hand on the La Bispesa stele, as well as being severely damaged, is actually of a completely different kind. So, there are two ways that we can understand this text, in my opinion, at least. But it's very difficult. It's not easy to interpret. We can compare it with historical Basque and Proto-Basque if we want to. That would be one way. But I have only found one word that might be similar to it, and it's written differently as well. The second way would be to compare it with Iberian Basque that has been documented in almost 2,500 inscriptions. However, the work carried out so far has not yielded any clear results yet. So I think at least the first line of the text can be understood as an offering to a god. The god would be in the sorioneke of the first line, which may mean happiness or fortune. And the verb would be the last word, eraukun, which means emansuen or emansion, which means gave him. So from a formal point of view, Sorion Eke can be compared with the name Erauskoritz Eje from Aharraitze, with the ending he or ehe, which appears in some names of gods from Aquitaine and the Basque territories. And the last word, iraukun, recalls the 16th century derauko and also some of the forms of the verb iradun. I know this is really rather abstract, but what I am trying to say is that there are some elements of Basque in these words, despite the fact that problems still exist. So there are serious problems with the with all of this, and the asymmetry of the documents also don't help either. So Basque is very, very far away. We don't understand Iberian. There are no texts in Aquitaine. The Iberian script and the Latin alphabet don't coincide when it comes to writing, nor do the sounds of the language, etc. So there are a lot of different problems here. So this text, I think, at least, or I see it like a valuable fossil. Because we need to remember that unless fossils are located or placed in their correct place in a phylogenetic tree, which shows all the different species, then they don't really provide very much information or any kind of explanation. So what we do know about the origin of Basque remains as obscure, or as clear, if you like, if you want to be positive about it, as before. As far as its antiquity is concerned, the question is now actually even more complicated because many different hypotheses have been put forward as a result of the discovery of this hand. So it's now even more difficult. So at the moment, we don't have any clear answers. So what do we need? Well, we need more texts in order to be able to answer all of these questions. And just as after the appearance of the Lurga inscription, the discovery of Basque names multiplied and Basque nouns multiplied, we hope that more text, very similar to that which we can find on the Irulegi hand, will appear. Hopefully they'll be a bit clearer. That would be great. And to quote De Cepare, we would also say that we hope that, and I quote, the discovery of Irulegi will be followed by better fortune. Thank you all very much for your attention.